Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Biden warned Thursday of an imminent surge of COVID-19 cases as the Omicron coronavirus variant continues to spread around the world and across the U.S. at an unprecedented pace.
For unvaccinated, we are looking at a winter of severe illness and death for unvaccinated, for themselves, their families, and the hospitals will soon overwhelm.
U.S. COVID-19 hospitalizations continue to rise, with nearly 1,300 people dying of the disease each day in the United States. Amidst the surge, many prominent universities, including NYU, DePaul, and Princeton, have returned to online classes. Cornell University canceled most campus activities after 1,100 students tested positive for coronavirus in just 1 week. The NFL, the National Football League, and the NBA, the National Basketball Association, have announced new COVID-19 protocols after dozens of players tested positive this week. Here in New York City, Mayor Bill de Blasio has announced plans to distribute 1 million high-quality masks and 500,000 at-home COVID-19 tests. The Centers for Disease Control said Thursday people should avoid use of Johnson & Johnson's COVID-19 vaccine and should instead opt for vaccines produced by Pfizer and Moderna. A vaccine advisory panel cited the risk of extremely rare but life-threatening blood clots linked to J&J shots. Meanwhile, the American Civil Liberties Union warns Immigration and Customs Enforcement is denying COVID booster shots to some 21,000 prisoners being held in ICE jails around the U.S. An ACLU attorney said, quote, "This is yet another example of ICE's cavalier approach to the health and safety of people in detention in violation of their constitutional rights, and underscores the inherent danger of detention in the first place," they said. The Food and Drug Administration has permanently removed the in-person restriction on accessing abortion pills, allowing patients to receive the medication by mail after a telehealth consultation. Previously, pregnant people had to go to an on-site provider to take the prescription drug, though that requirement was lifted during the pandemic. The medication, mifepristone, was approved by the FDA in 2000 and has become an increasingly popular method of abortion. It's used in conjunction with the drug misoprostol. Reproductive rights advocates hailed the FDA decision at a time when the fate of Roe v. Wade hangs in the balance with a conservative majority Supreme Court. A federal judge has thrown out a roughly $4.5 billion settlement with Purdue Pharma that shielded the Sackler family from future lawsuits. Judge Colleen McMahon of the Southern District of New York ruled the bankruptcy court does not have the authority to grant the Sacklers such legal protection. The Sacklers have refused to acknowledge any personal responsibility in the deadly opioid crisis. In Chile, the widow of former U.S.-backed dictator Augusto Pinochet has died at the age of 99. Lucia Iriart married General Pinochet in 1943 and stood by him as he toppled the democratically elected President Salvador Allende in a bloody 1973 coup supported by the Nixon administration. During Pinochet's 17-year reign, more than 3,000 Chileans were murdered and disappeared. Tens of thousands more were tortured. Iriart's death was announced just days before Sunday's presidential election, pitting far-right candidate José Antonio Cast against leftist Gabriel Boric, a former student leader. In Santiago, large crowds gathered to celebrate news of Iriart's passing.
For now, all I can feel is joy, but also anger because she died without paying for her crimes. But there's hope with Gabriel Boric's candidacy for the presidency, for a fair presidency that is full of love and justice. We can return to having a country we can all love that was taken from us 30 years ago.
Super Typhoon Rai, struck the southeastern Philippines Thursday with winds topping 160 miles per hour. At least 7 deaths have been reported, nearly 100,000 people evacuated ahead of landfall. The typhoon is the third Category 5 storm to make landfall in the Philippines in the past 2 years. In Kentucky, workers who survived the tornado that flattened a candle factory in the city of Mayfield last week have sued their employer, charging Mayfield Consumer Products with flagrant indifference that led to the deaths of 8 people. The lawsuit alleges managers had up to 3.5 hours to evacuate the factory amid reports of approaching severe weather, but instead chose to threaten workers with termination if they left their shifts early. A union representing 1,400 Kellogg's workers has reached a tentative agreement with the cereal giant on a new 5-year contract. If approved by workers during a weekend vote, the deal will end a more than 2-month strike at 4 Kellogg's plants. A previous tentative agreement that would have brought 3% raises was rejected by an overwhelming majority of workers. In Massachusetts, workers at 2 Boston-area Starbucks stores have announced a unionization effort. Their campaign comes after workers at a Buffalo Starbucks location voted last week to form the first U.S.-based union at Starbucks. In Los Angeles County, workers at a cake factory that produces desserts for chain stores including Walmart and Baskin-Robbins are on a day 45 of a strike demanding better working conditions. The mostly Latinx immigrant workers say they're forced to work up to 15 hours a day, have to produce 13 cakes per minute, and are granted only 3 sick days a year. The Senate parliamentarian has rejected Democrats' third bid to include immigration reform in the Build Back Better bill. The proposal included granting work permits and deportation protections to millions of people. The news prompted a swift rebuke from immigrant justice advocates and Democratic lawmakers. New York Congressmember Jamal Bowman tweeted, quote, "The parliamentarian is not an elected official. Their guidance is advisory, not law. The Republicans have fired the parliamentarian to pass their tax cuts for the wealthy. Democrats must overrule the parliamentarian to pass immigration reform," he said. Axios is reporting the Biden administration has stopped holding undocumented families in detention centers, relying instead on electronic ankle bracelets and other tracking methods. The administration's not announced an official policy ending the harmful practice, and facilities are still holding adults in often inhumane conditions. Immigrant rights advocates have also condemned the intense surveillance of migrants and likened monitoring devices to shackles. In related news, the Justice Department has pulled out of talks to compensate migrant families who were separated at the border under Trump's zero-tolerance policy. Over 5,000 children, including babies, were ripped from their families, which Biden has called a moral and national shame. But last month, Biden rejected reports his administration could offer up to $450,000 per family, saying, quote, "That's not going to happen." Haitian officials announced Thursday the remaining 12 North American missionaries who were kidnapped in October have been released. 5 others had previously been freed. The Gang 400 Mawozo had initially demanded a ransom of $1 million for each of the 17 hostages. It's not been confirmed whether any money was exchanged for the release, though one source said a smaller amount was paid to the gang, but not by the U.S. government. Jean Montreville, the immigrant activist and former U.S. permanent resident who was abruptly deported to Haiti in 2018, has been given 3 years of deferred action that will allow him to remain in the United States to pursue a path to permanent status. This comes as a result of a settlement in his First Amendment lawsuit against the U.S. government. Montreville argued federal immigration officials targeted him for his activism, including his criticism of the Trump administration's policies towards Haiti. We'll speak with Jean Montreville and his lawyer on Monday. You can see more than a decade of our interviews with him at our website, democracynow.org. And in Buenos Aires, Argentina, representative of Burma's Rohingya Muslim minority testified in court Thursday as a trial got underway against senior Burmese military officials, charging them with crimes against humanity. The case was brought under the principle of universal jurisdiction, which allows for serious international crimes to be prosecuted even if they were committed in another nation. First to testify was activist Maung Tun Khin, one of an estimated 730,000 Rohingya Muslims who fled Burma after a military-led crackdown in 2017.
My brothers and sisters were brutally killed and murdered by Burmese military, and thousands of our sisters were raped by Burmese military. I'm a victim. I'm a genocide survivor. Many genocide survivors, we want to get justice. So we are seeking justice as under universal jurisdiction case.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
A lot happening yesterday here in Brussels, the final EU Leaders Summit for the year. But I have to ask you, the big worry is the new variant. It's Omicron. And I remember you were the first person who said by July this year, everyone in Europe would have a vaccine, there would be herd immunity. So given that you do seem to have a good oracle, is everyone going to have a booster shot, and when is that going to happen?
Well, no, that's very true. The vaccine strategy has been, again, very high topic for everyone. The good news, if I may say so, is that we have enough vaccine for Europe. We have enough vaccine also for the booster. We're producing more than 200 million doses per month. But of course, we still need to convince 15 to 17% of the population to be vaccinated. And also now to make sure that everyone who is eligible will be able to get the booster. And it will be the case. We have the quote-unquote ammunition, including with the new booster that we will adapt now for the variant. But of course, now we need to rush.
And how many million doses do you see when? I know you're working specifically with mRNA. This is Moderna, Pfizer.
Yeah.
You're not working with AstraZeneca. Many reasons for that. But when do you see the deliveries for those booster shots?
Well, we just ordered a new 180 million doses now.
180 million.
180 million now with the new, let's say, vaccine to be adapted to the variant. But of course, we know that what is extremely important, because in fact, I think everyone should understand that we have two pandemics. In fact, we are still coping with the Delta variant, and which is the vast majority here in Central Europe. So we need to get vaccinated, and we have more than enough, of course. And now, of course, to be prepared for the new one, the Omicron, and we will be ready. But also, I think it's important to know that we are the first exporter of vaccine worldwide. Both China, both the US, both everyone. We will continue to export to everyone, including for our British friends, which are depending so much from us and are in so terrible situation.
And of course, that is a message that Europe always likes to remind the UK. We are exporting vaccines, or you say we're in a terrible situation. When you look at what is happening, it's terrible, you say. When you look at what's happening in the UK, does that scare you? Does it worry you? Or actually, do you feel ultimately the same is going to happen here? Is it specific, though, to the UK?
Again, we have to be very cautious. What is important is that, of course, the UK is so dependent from Europe for so many things, including for the vaccine, that I want to say to our British friends, don't worry, we will continue to deliver what you need.
And the message that you're passing on is clear. I wonder what the reaction would be on it.
No, the message is that in Europe we handle this together.
And, I have to ask you, the other issue that was very contentious yesterday, but I know you're very direct, and you're going to give me a clear answer on this. On nuclear energy, it does seem that bills are now going up in Europe. There's a big energy crisis happening going into Christmas. Is nuclear a good idea or not?
Well, I've been always extremely clear. In order to achieve our Green Deal and the zero CO2 emission by 2050, we will need nuclear energy. Everybody is saying the contrary. It's just not saying the truth. Because we need, on one hand, to double the electricity that we produce. Today, we are producing already 26% of our electricity from nuclear. So there is no way that we will be able to do this without nuclear energy.
So you say there's no green transition without nuclear energy. If you say that, it's a lie.
I'm clear. It's just, and I think everyone understands this. So now, of course, the question is that in the so-called taxonomy, which is again how to organize ourselves to finance what is needed to achieve this Green Deal. So now the question is to put in a delegated act how to handle the situation with gas and nuclear energy, and I have no doubt that we will be able to reach an agreement in the next few weeks.
Shifting our focus now, the International Monetary Fund will close its office in Brazil a day after receiving harsh criticism from Brazil's economy minister. IMF has predicted a contraction of 9.7% for Latin America's biggest economy in 2020. IMF said that it will pull out of Brazil once the current contract expires next year in June. Now the move came after Economy Minister Paulo Guedes said that the IMF was overly pessimistic in its forecast on Brazil and was no longer welcome. He said, and I'm quoting here, they can go take a walk. He also accused the officials in the global financial body of being more interested in leisurely activities like football than in helping the economy. The International Monetary Fund had predicted inflation, high unemployment, high public debt, poverty among the economic challenges. Low potential growth for Brazil was also mentioned in its latest report. So the IMF opened its office in Brazil in 1999. This was when the country was really under an economic crisis. That program ended in 2005. But the office remained for two-way dialogue. The Brazilian government has promised of a stronger economy ahead of elections next year. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.
The United States is the world's current leader in incarceration, with almost 2 million people serving time in U.S. jails and prisons. That's an increase of 500% over 40 years, according to the Sentencing Project, an NGO working to promote humane responses to crime. In recent years, voices calling for police and prison abolition have grown louder, making them an inexorable part of mainstream discourse on how to confront police brutality and racism in the U.S. criminal justice system. But the calls for abolition are not new. In 1970, political activist and university professor Angela Davis was jailed for 16 months, with the early part of her incarceration spent in solitary confinement. The case against Davis, who was once called a terrorist by former President Richard Nixon and listed by J. Edgar Hoover on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list for her radical politics, led to a global outcry calling for her freedom. 2 years later, she was acquitted of all charges and began a movement to abolish the prison industrial complex. But is abolition really possible? And what would take place instead of police and prison? This week, an Upfront special with Angela Davis. Angela Davis, thank you so much for joining me on Upfront. The past couple of years have revealed to many Americans and much of the rest of the world what people of color have long known. The U.S. criminal legal system is racist, and attempts at incremental reform have failed. But you and others have called for the abolition of police. Why?
Well, we've known for a very long time that the structure of racism, it's such that it invades virtually all of the existing institutions in our society, and especially the penal institutions and law enforcement institutions. One cannot study the history of the police without also studying the history of racism. And so, I would say that since the aftermath of slavery, people have been aware of the role that the police play in producing and reproducing racism. I think that over the years, we focus largely on addressing specific cases, and we called for justice for specific individuals, and we called for specific police officers to be, quote, brought to justice. And in recent years, it's become clear that that isn't going to solve the problem. And I want to point out the fact that the coming together of movements against racism in the U.S. And movements against the occupation of Palestine have begun to make it clear how the structures of racism insinuate themselves into police, into the very nature of policing, and especially recently through the militarization of policing. So in recent years, we've been looking at structural issues more so than the notion of bringing individuals to justice. And certainly the call to defund the police, which emerged in relation to the campaign against police racism unleashed by the police lynching of George Floyd. Certainly that movement began to make it clear that we need we need different forms of guaranteeing safety and security. So the call to defund the police was really actually a call to imagine new ways of guaranteeing the safety and security of our communities.
Some people have made arguments that gesture toward abolition but don't maybe go all the way there. For example, some people have argued to disarm the police. Why is that insufficient in the minds of abolitionists?
Well, you know, I don't think we need to be so intransigent that we can't also embrace approaches that don't go nearly as far as we think they should. Now, I personally think that the call to disarm the police is a radical call. As a matter of fact, in connection with efforts to address the fact that there are more guns in this country than there are people, and the call to disarm the country also has to include a call to disarm the police. So I think that it's possible to frame that demand in a radical abolitionist way.
And would the same argument be made for defunding? Because again, some people say defunding stops short. Do you see defunding as a stop on the way to abolition, or can it be something that prevents us from ultimately getting to an abolitionist world?
You know, there's no easy way to define abolition. And in my mind, abolition is a process. And I don't think that we can, at this point, say that we will have reached the triumphant moment of abolition when 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 occurs. It is a process, and we learn on the way. And defund the police, of course, it's a shortcut. You know, all of these demands are shortcuts. We can't simply focus on isolated issues, isolated phenomena. We can't say defund the police, take all the funds away from the police, but leave everything else intact. The whole nature of that demand is to shift the resources into institutions that can really assist us in producing new modes of safety and security. So instead of giving the funding to this violent institution called the police, you know, fund mental health care, fund housing, fund education, fund free health care for everyone.
What do you see as some of the primary reasons why people oppose abolition? Right? I mean, of course there are the dyed-in-the-wool racists who just want to see police terrorism, right? There are those people, and there are people who might be uninformed about the issue. But there are also people who have a general sense of what abolitionists are asking for and still say, I don't buy this. I don't believe in it. 15% of Americans support abolition the police. That means 85% don't. And the majority of black people believe that the police presence should remain the same. What are some of the reasons for that? Why are people still in this position?
Well, you know, first of all, Mark, let me say that the very fact that we can say that 15% of the population is in favor of abolition is kind of amazing because for so long, abolitionist perspectives have been considered so marginalized that they did not even merit a discussion within the public sphere. And so as someone who has been thinking and talking and organizing around abolition since the 1970s, I would say since the Attica Rebellion in 1971, I'm actually surprised, and I continue to be surprised that we are having this conversation now in the way that we are. I always thought, as I've said many times, that we were doing work that would allow generations in the future to have this conversation. You know, but of course history doesn't unfold in that way, and the kind of confluence of events that occurred when George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were killed, and the recognition of the nature of racism as structural in connection with the COVID-19 pandemic, sort of fast-forwarded us to a point where we are now having serious conversations about abolition. So I'm excited that many people are embracing abolition. Now, I do understand that most people are afraid of the new, of the unknown. And the police have always represented themselves as those who protect and serve. And so I think that particularly black people who have rarely had the opportunity to be protected and served by the police still, want to feel safety and security. And the problem is that the police have kind of, in an ideological sense, have represented themselves as the only possibility of safety and security. So I think it's our job to begin to urge people to think differently about the very meaning of safety and security. And what would it mean to have real safety, real security? What would it mean to have education available to everyone, free education? What would it mean to have health care? What would it mean not to have to call the police if someone who is in someone who has a psychiatric episode? What would it mean not to have to call the police, but rather to call a different kind of agency or institution where people are compassionate and understand the nature of psychic difficulties, and would not approach the person with guns, but rather with a sense of rescuing them and assisting them to find some peace.
One of the things that I've encountered is that when I talk about abolition with people, one of the issues that comes up is that the people who are often most vulnerable to police violence and the people who are most likely abused by police are also the people most vulnerable to violent crime. And there's a concern that if police aren't there, and I live in a neighborhood where there's high amounts of crime and violence, that there might be either an intermediate period during abolition where I'm especially vulnerable, or a long-term period where I don't have faith that crime will be reduced absent a police presence. How do we go about thinking about deterring violent crimes? There's a psychiatric piece, there's that piece of it, but what about the violent crime that we see in community, the harm that's done? How do we think about deterring that?
Well, first of all, Mark, the developments that have led to the explosive character of violence in our communities have taken a very long time. This situation has developed over years and decades, and I would say hundreds of years. And I don't think that there is one simple solution. The problem is that the police and the prison are constantly proposed as the immediate solutions for problems that require long-term examination and long-term strategies. We're looking at predicaments that evolve over time since the aftermath of slavery, and if we think that there is one simple solution, if we think we're going to get rid of these problems tomorrow, then we'll never get anywhere.
You talked about prison as well, and that's another key part of the abolition movement. And in fact, prior to a few years ago, I would argue, the prison abolition conversation was actually much louder than the police abolition conversation. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about that. As of 2019, there were 2 million people in prison in the United States. That's a 500% increase over 40 years. That's the highest incarceration rate in the world. And although black people make up 13% of the U.S. population, we still account for 40% of the incarcerated population. How do we go about putting a dent in those kinds of stunning numbers?
Well, first of all, I think it might be important to recall that for many years and decades, it was very difficult to bring attention to the crisis within the prison system. As a matter of fact, I can remember in the 70s we were talking about the numbers of people who were behind bars, and it was a few 100,000 people, but that to us seemed to be a major crisis. But people weren't prepared to hear about it because the nature of the institution itself requires a kind of clandestine operation, that it is hidden from view, and people are made to feel ashamed about having relatives behind bars. And so I think we tended to focus more on the prison system than on the police, because at least there were campaigns against police violence. I can remember in the 70s we held hearings. I was working with an organization called the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, and we held hearings about racist police violence all over the country. So there was some attention, even though it wasn't the kind of attention that the issue has received in the last few years, especially since the emergence of Black Lives Matter, whereas very few people were even thinking about the vast numbers of people who were hidden away in these dungeons. But I would argue that the two issues have always gone hand in hand. Abolition requires a much broader understanding and a view that doesn't focus myopically on the particular issue, but one that calls for transformations throughout the society. And therefore, prison abolition involved police abolition as well. Now, the prison abolition movement was so important and continues to be important because the underlying analysis links the racism in the criminal justice system and the vast numbers of people of color, not only black people, but indigenous people probably have suffered even to a greater extent, because indigenous people are per capita the largest population in relation to the population of indigenous people behind bars. So I think that what was critical about that movement is that it linked the vast numbers of people who were going to prison to the rise of global capitalism and to the breakdown of the welfare state. And so there was an anti-capitalist dimension present in the prison abolitionist movement that encouraged people to think more broadly, not only about the prison, but about all of the other related institutions, and about the structural racism inherent, and about the impact of global capitalism and the rise of prisons all over the world, not only in the developed world, but also in Africa and in Latin America.
I think the most asked question to the abolitionist is, and I think it's a fair question, is, but what about the people who pose an immediate threat to others? What do we do with the child molesters? What do we do with the rapists? What do we do with the serial killers? How do we, in the absence of the current prison, as we understand it, deal with people who pose an immediate threat to community?
It's so interesting, isn't it, Mark, that people always go to the worst possible example, and then use that as a justification for the treatment of millions of people who have not engaged in that kind of harmful activity. Now, no one is denying that there are serious acts of harm and violence that are produced by individuals are a threat to others and to themselves. But if we simply argue that because there is this relatively small population of people, then we lock up more than 2 million people, to me that is illogical. That's the first point. The second point is that imprisonment reproduces those very problems.
Deal with people who pose an immediate threat to communities?
It's so interesting, isn't it, Mark, that people always go to the worst possible example and then use that as a justification for the treatment of millions of people who have not engaged in that kind of harmful activity. Now, no one is denying that there are serious acts of harm and violence that are produced by individuals are a threat to others and to themselves. But if we simply argue that because there is this relatively small population of people, then we lock up more than 2 million people, to me that is illogical. That's the first point. The second point is that imprisonment reproduces those very problems. And so the violent individual who goes to prison is in a situation where she or he or they become even more violent as a result of the structural violence of the institution than they were when they went in. So, in my opinion, and I think this is what most abolitionists would argue, it's necessary to pull back and ask larger questions, not only how we deal with this immediate issue, but rather how to deal with it in the long term. How can we understand and get rid of the conditions that produce such violence in individuals? I think gender violence is probably a really good example for this larger problem. Simply by imprisoning people who engage in gender violence has not had an impact at all on the incidence of gender violence in the world. It is still the most pandemic form of violence. So that, it seems to me, would signal that we have to figure out how to deal with the problem itself, rather than simply incarcerating people who commit the violence. How can we deal with the conditions that produce individuals that are primed to engage in these kinds of violent acts against women, against LGBTQ people, against trans people, all of the forms of violence that we would categorize under the term gender violence. So the larger question is, how do we address the ideology that encourages people to take out their frustrations and their fears by attacking others in that way?
And it seems that there is a very narrow idea of what restraint can look like, what separation can look like. The Quakers talked about, in that book, Instead of Prisons, they talked about this idea of restraint of the few, saying that there might be some people who need to be pulled out of society because they pose an immediate threat, but it seems that the challenge might also be that the only way we've imagined that is through caging, and that there might be other ways, whether it's mental health support, whether it's some other structure that can allow someone who is a serial killer or someone who is a child molester to be pulled out of the space where they're doing harm without using the cage as the primary mechanism. But that requires a new kind of imagination. And it seems that there might be a crisis of imagination in the policy realm, in the academic realm, in the activist realm. So I'm going to ask you to help us imagine a little bit before we go. When you think about an affirmative vision of the world, not just what we don't want, police and prisons, but what we do want, what does that look like for Angela Davis? What does the abolitionist future look like?
Well, I've always linked abolition with socialism. So I would say that in imagining the future, it cannot be a capitalist future. It cannot be a future that is based on the exploitation of others. This future would be one in which the necessities of life are not commodified, in which one's capacity to live a fruitful life is not dependent on one's capacity to pay for those services. So, you know, the point that I'm making is that we have to go further than these two discrete institutions, that we have to think about reorganizing our entire world. And I think that the danger of positing abolition as a narrow strategy that only addresses particular individuals is one that will prevent us from understanding that this is about revolution. This is about environmental justice. This is about workers' rights. This is about eradicating gender violence. You know, this is about making education free for everyone. And so I could continue with that, you know, kind of imagining of the future. But I do think that the abolitionist imagination is central to the process of envisioning a new world and developing the strategies for challenging the current one.
Angela Davis, thank you so much for joining me on Upfront.
Thank you, Mark, for inviting me.
Everybody, that is our show. Upfront, we'll be back next week.
Here we go for today's number. It's December 17, 2021. 10 balls. Each ball has a number. Numbers 1 through 10. Swirl the numbers. Pick a number. Today's number is 3.
An Indian festival has been bestowed with an international honor, the Festival of Durga Puja in Kolkata. It has been accorded heritage status by the UNESCO, the first festival in all of Asia to receive such an honor. It's a proud moment for India, from the Prime Minister to the Chief Minister of Bengal. Reactions are pouring in from all sides of the political spectrum. Here's a report.
It celebrates feminine divinity. It marks the victory of good over evil. It has now brought glory to the country. The festival of Durga Puja in Kolkata has been bestowed with an international honor. It has been accorded heritage status by the UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. It has inscribed Durga Puja as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity, meaning it is a non-physical intellectual token of India's rich culture, a culture which should be safeguarded through global recognition. It is a proud moment for the state of West Bengal and a red letter moment for all Indians. Because this is the first festival in all of Asia to get such a recognition from a global body. The decision was taken during the 16th session of UNESCO's Intergovernmental Committee. The committee commended Kolkata's Durga Puja for its initiatives in involving marginalized groups, also for celebrating the spirit of womanhood. India is elated with the honor. Reactions are pouring in online. The Prime Minister has hailed it as a matter of great pride and joy, calling Kolkata's Durga Puja an experience everyone must have. The Chief Minister of West Bengal says she is beaming with joy. She says the Durga Puja is not just a festival but an emotion. India's Ministry of Culture is overjoyed as well. It has called the festival a confluence of India's art, craft and rich culture. It certainly is. And with UNESCO's honor, it will only grow in prominence. A UNESCO tag to the festival means global recognition, which in return could lead to a revamp of infrastructure, civic amenities and working conditions for all artists and organizers involved in setting up those magnanimous Durga pandals each year. So far, UNESCO's list of intangible heritage has a total of 492 elements. Out of this, 14 are from India. This includes Kuthiyatham, a form of Sanskrit theatre practiced in the state of Kerala, Vedic chanting, an ancient Hindu tradition of reciting Vedic literature, Ram Leela, a traditional performance of the Hindu epic Ramayana, Raman, a religious festival in the state of Uttarakhand, marked with the recitation of various local legends. The Chau dance from eastern India, a traditional dance form that enacts episodes from Mahabharata and Ramayana. The Kalbelia folk songs and dances of Rajasthan, performed primarily by women who replicate the movements of a serpent, as men accompany them with a percussion instrument. The Mudiyetu from Kerala, a ritual dance form based on a battle between goddess Kali and the demon Darika. The Buddhist chanting of Ladakh, a recitation of sacred Buddhist texts performed in monasteries and villages in Ladakh. Sankirtana, an annual ritual from the state of Manipur which celebrates the life of the Vaishnava people. In 2014, the craft of Khateras from Punjab made it to the list. It is a traditional technique of making brass and copper utensils in Punjab. In 2017, the festival celebrated as New Year by the Parsi community of India was also included in UNESCO's list, as was the practice of yoga and Kumbh Mela, the largest congregation of pilgrims on the entire planet.
Russia has released a list of the security guarantees it wants from NATO before it de-escalates the military standoff at Ukraine's border, where Moscow has stationed tens of thousands of troops. More from the BBC's Steve Rosenberg.
This is the first time that Russia has spelled out in public the security guarantees it is demanding from the West. But it's unlikely America and NATO will want to sign on Moscow's dotted line. One of the draft agreements proposed by Russia would apparently require NATO to withdraw troops and weaponry from countries that joined the North Atlantic Alliance after May 1997. That includes Poland, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia. Russia is also demanding an end to NATO enlargement eastwards, so that countries like Ukraine and Georgia, once firmly in Moscow's sphere of influence, would never become members.
The Turkish lira has continued its steep fall on the currency market, dropping 6% to a new all-time low amid fears of a new inflationary spiral. It follows another interest rate cut on Thursday. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has also announced a minimum wage hike of 50%, adding to fears of further price rises. In cricket, Steve Smith says he's feeling relaxed in his role as stand-in captain while Pat Cummins is in COVID-related isolation. Smith made 93 on day 2 of the second test against England, helping his side to a formidable total of 9 for 473 declared. Smith told ABC Sport he's happy to help out.
I'm pretty chilled and relaxed, obviously leading this week in
allow remote work again as Omicron rages. Wondering if there'll be layoffs. Cheddar, we will see. That's exactly right. We're down 34 cents on Apple. We're going negative again. The Dow is down 341, falling. S&P down 20, falling. NASDAQ up 30, but backing off. And Apple right now is not leading the upside. It's leading the downside. We're down 29 on Apple, 171.97.
Good morning. It's December 17, 2021, and if you can believe it, it's a Friday once again. Here in LA, a somewhat clear morning, very still right now. 45 degrees Fahrenheit, around 7 Celsius. Today, I was sort of longing for warm weather, and I started thinking about the song Surfer Girl by the Beach Boys from 1963. This afternoon, it's going to be going up to 66 degrees Fahrenheit, about 19 Celsius. And even though it'll be chilly, everything's relative, chilly for LA, we're going to be enjoying those beautiful blue skies and golden sunshine all along the way. Everyone, have a great day.
Let's start with the first paragraph, starting with recalling the obligation of all parties to an armed conflict, and so on and so forth. But rather focus. in accordance with the regular practice under the CCW.
Nous allons commencer.
And so we are going to start.
We are going to start. More copies will be are coming now. In any case, the document will be on the screen, and you have received the document on your email address. Because we lack of time, we have no other choice than to wait to start now. But copies are coming. The copy machine is a bit slow, but it's ongoing. But I think we can start. Thank you very much. Okay, the document will be on your screen very soon. Et je vais passer au français puisque.
If I may, I'll slip back into French, given that we do have interpreters. So looking at the documents, we are reviewing Agenda Item 20, which consists of considering and adopting the final documents of our conference. We were at an agenda item on closing the work of the conference, during which delegations indicated their desire to make statements, and so we need to leave time for those statements and declarations. And so for the consideration of the final document, I would ask for your patience. Please be precise and direct. Otherwise, it will be difficult to manage the small amount of time that remains. And so here is the document submitted for your consideration. This is a document of a classical traditional structure for CCW documents. Therefore, there are two parts. Part 1, which we will consider after Part 2. I propose that we look at Part 2 first, concerning the final declaration, because this Part 2 could be reviewed and adopted before we adopt the preceding Part 1, the report on our procedures. It seems to me logical to proceed that way. And so let us move to page 5 of the report, which is now on your screen. I see no objections, so I assume everyone is in agreement with this way of proceeding. So we're looking at pages 5.
Ready? 3, 2, no, you don't say anything. I'm counting it in. It's my show.
You don't say the 1. You go 3, 2, and then we throw it to you.
And page 7. We have a preamble for the final declaration.
Happy holidays, everyone. I'm
that
Zach
preamble
Galifianakis.
was proposed by Main Committee 1.
Okay. I'm here today with
In
special
the
guest Samuel
preamble,
Jackson. And
there are 2 paragraphs
Mr. Jackson, I want to say congratulations.
with
on
square
Best
brackets.
Die Hard Runner.
And so I would propose that we hone in immediately on those 2 paragraphs in square brackets to see whether it is possible to lift them or not. Can we delete the square brackets? Let's start with the first paragraph, starting with recalling the obligation of all parties to an armed conflict, and so on and so forth. I don't want to reopen discussion on the text, because I think that we completed that negotiations exercise on all of the paragraphs in square brackets. What I would like is to see whether we can now delete those square brackets. I'm talking now just about the first paragraph in square brackets. 5 lines starting with recalling the obligation of all parties to an armed conflict to take all feasible precautions, etc. My question to you is to see whether we can delete those square brackets. I see that the esteemed delegation of Cuba has asked the floor.
Orden de poder avanzar lo más.
I just would like to, in the vein of being able to move forward quickly, we could keep this in square brackets because we think that throughout the declaration there are 3 paragraphs on this topic, and in addition there are 2 decisions. So I think that we could move forward with decisions 3 and 4, and then we could remove the square brackets. The only reason we have the square brackets is to strike a balance, not really due to linguistic issues. Thank you, Chairman.
I do like the movie.
Ok, effectivement, il y a un lien.
Indeed, there is a connection between the brackets and square brackets. They are connected, and other parts of the text further on also. And so I would like to leave that paragraph in square brackets and move on to the next one, which is also in square brackets, and which starts with reaffirming their strong determination to protect civilians from the deleterious, etc. I ask of you the same question on this short paragraph. Can we delete the square brackets around this line?
I'd like to thank Samuel L. Jackson.
I see that Mexico wishes to take the floor.
And happy holidays, everyone. Singing Little
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you. Just briefly, my delegation believes that since this is language that has been adopted by previous conferences and there's been no change, so we can keep this paragraph and get rid of the square brackets. Thank you.
Très bien. Roumanie.
Very good. Romania, if you please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you all. I will be very brief, since there are other issues that are in further consideration in this document.
so inspiring. I just love it.
Good morning. It's